Well, thanks, John, and good evening, everybody. Good evening. Yeah, we're here to have some fun, learn something. It'll be good. I just want to welcome you all, and I want to thank our partners at Literati. And we have quite a few other partners, which I'll get to in a second. But in particularly all of our U of M Sustainable Food Systems Initiative partners. Thank you all for coming. Okay, so this is the first event of the year, and it's not just a normal year, it's a special year. It's a year-long celebration of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And in 1970, Earth Day occurred, and in 2020, you can do the math, we're the 50th anniversary. And it turns out that the University of Michigan was the place where they initiated environmental teach-ins in advance of Earth Day. So University of Michigan is very proud of the fact that it informed and really got the whole movement going. I mean, obviously a lot of other people contributed as well. So what we're going to do is have a year-long celebration, hopefully with a crescendo along the way in March, and really try to rekindle the environmental consciousness and action that occurred back in the early 1970s. And of course, tomorrow, don't forget, is the Climate Action Strike here on campus and off campus. It's in the road. But this is, I think, part and parcel of what we're doing. We're seeing particularly the younger generations really step up to push us to solve the climate change crisis. And it is, as a person who's worked in the field for over 30 years, it genuinely is a crisis and could get a hell of a lot worse if we don't deal with it soon. So this initiative, which we call Earth Day 50, involves collaboration between a large number of schools and units and programs across the university. We're all coming together around this. And it's because climate change is an issue that impacts all of us and cannot be solved by any one discipline or any one group of people. We all have to figure out the solutions together. But I'd like to thank our Earth Year sponsors who signed up as promotional partners for this event: the School of Public Health, the Institute for Social Research, the Office of Research, the College of Literature, Science and Arts, Ford School of Public Policy, and the UM program in the environment, as well as the Herb Institute, which is a joint institute between SEAS, the School for Environment and Sustainability, and the Ross School of Business. So food. This is a talk tonight about climate change and a lot more, because when we think about food and agrosystems, it's certainly these have a big impact on our climate system, and we're going to need to be able to manage these systems better to be able to bring the CO2 and other greenhouse gases down in the atmosphere. But at the same time, of course, food has serious implications for our health, and some of the practices that we utilize to grow our food and to process our food and to transport our food and deal with the food waste. These are all things that need to be solved for reasons that aren't just climate. But I'll tell you, as a climate scientist, there's much more we have to do. So I hope you all leave this room tonight thinking, I'm going to do something about food, about sustainable, make our food systems more sustainable. I'm going to do this as an individual actor. I'm going to do this with my neighbors. I'm going to do this with fellow voters in this country. And at the same time, that we think about the broader causes of climate change and other environmental problems, and in general, environmental injustice that is piling up in this country and abroad. So as part of our series, I just want to mention that this is the first talk of the Earth Year at 50 series. The next one is going to be October 1st, and it's going to be Dan Kamen, who's coming from Berkeley, one of our sister universities out there in California. And he is one of the world-renowned experts on clean energy. So it's going to be terrific to hear from him, not only in what he knows as a scholar, but what he knows as from a position of practice. As you may have heard in the news this week, University of California System has declared they're going to go carbon neutral by 2025, and he'll have a lot of insights for us. U of M is going to go carbon neutral too. I don't think it'll be by 2025, but we're going to be well underway by 2025. So let's dig into today's program. Our moderator is Ivette Perfecto, and she is the George W. Pack Professor of Ecology, Natural Resources, and Environment. Her research focuses on biodiversity and arthropod-mediated ecosystem services in rural and urban agriculture. She works on spatial ecology, of coffee agrosystems, very important, and is interested more broadly in the links between small scale sustainable agriculture, biodiversity, and food sovereignty. Her research is carried out mostly in Mexico and Puerto Rico. She's also the co-author of 4 books, with I believe her co-authors probably in the room, and including The Breakfast of Biodiversity, Nature's Matrix, another one is called Nature's Matrix, Linking Agriculture, Conservation, and Food Sovereignty. So these are books that you could also grab and learn a lot about what's going on in our world. And it's not all good news, but we have to understand what's going on to be able to fix it. And our special guest tonight, that you all came to see, is Jonathan Safran Foer. He's an acclaimed author, even before he wrote this book, and is on the faculty of NYU's creative writing program. He's one of Rolling Stone's People of the Year. You listen to these things, this is amazing. You know, we always dream of this, and this guy he's the real deal. Esquire's Best and Brightest, and New Yorker magazine's 20 under 40 list of writers. His best-selling first book, Everything is Illuminated, he tells me I should make an illuminated pun, but I'm not smart enough, was named the Book of the Year by the Los Angeles Times and won numerous awards, including the Guardian's First Book Prize and the National Jewish Book Award. His second book, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, also a bestseller, was hailed by Salman Rushdie as ambitious, pyrotechnic, riddling, and above all, extremely moving. His third book, Eating Animals, getting a little closer to the topic tonight, offers a critique of factory farming and was written in close collaboration with Farm Forward, a nonprofit organization that implements innovative strategies to promote conscientious food choices, reduce farmed animal suffering, and advance sustainable agriculture. And Jonathan serves on the board of that organization. His new book, which we're going to be discussing tonight, We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast. In this book, Safran Foer highlights small behavioral changes that could help move the needle on climate change. We Are the Weather has won high praise already. You might have seen the New York Times review just recently this week by Mark Bittman. But it's won high praise as well from numerous outlets, including Booklist, describing it as deeply contemplative, artfully creative in his desire to convince others to take action. We'll see if he can convince everyone in this room, and I hope he will. And this from Publisher Weekly, Foer's message is both moving and painful, depressing and optimistic, and it'll force readers to rethink their commitment to combating the greatest crisis humankind has ever faced. And as a climate scientist, I think he's on target. So please help me welcome Jonathan Safran Foer and Ivette Perfecto.
Good evening, Jonathan.
Hello.
Welcome to Ann Arbor. It's a pleasure to have you here, of course. And I had the great privilege of reading a wonderful book. The main proposal, really, that Jonathan is making in this book is that the most important thing that we can do for the climate to prevent climate catastrophe is to eat less animal products. And I am asking why My question is, it feels like a little bit of a reluctance to talk more broadly about agriculture. There are extensions of millions of acres of soybean production, for example, in the Amazon, destroying the Amazon forest, and also in the Cerrado region. Also, fertilizer application is basically one of the most important contributors to nitrous oxide in the environment. And so why this reluctance to talk more broadly about industrial agriculture in particular?
Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for being in conversation with me. 98% of the world's soy crop is fed to animals. And animal agriculture is the leading source of nitrous oxide emissions. So if those two things are concerns, this is the most effective way to be concerned with soy and nitrous oxide. But what I would say is, this is not a book that is a kind of either-or book about climate change. Like either we concern ourselves with animal agriculture or we put solar panels on our roof. Either we endorse some form of a carbon tax or we assume complete responsibility in our own lives. We are very much at the point of both and. We need to do as many of these things as we can, with the acknowledgement that humans have logistical limits and also psychological limits. But at the same time, it's also important to have in mind a hierarchy of the meaningfulness of the changes that we might make. So there's been an emphasis, especially in schools, on activities like recycling or refraining from using plastic straws. And those things are good to do, and we should do those things, but they are not as important as other things that we could do. We know, I believe uncontroversially, that there are 4 activities that an individual can take, or 4 choices that we make that are high impact and matter more than the rest, which are flying less, living car-free, having fewer children, somehow managing global population, and moving toward plant-based eating. So 85% of Americans drive to work, and many of us live in cities that were designed to require automobiles. More than half of the flights that are taken in the United States are either for work or for non-leisure personal purposes, like visiting a sick relative. Most people, my guess is most people in this audience, are not at this moment contemplating whether or not to have another child. So those are 3 things that we have to get under control, but they're in a slightly different category than eating, which is a choice that we make 3 times a day, and is the only one of those that immediately addresses nitrous oxide, which you mentioned, and methane, which are 2 extremely powerful greenhouse gases. Methane is 86 times as powerful as carbon over 2 decades, and nitrous oxide is 310 times as powerful, which is to say, if you imagine global warming as a blanket around the planet that's holding heat against the planet, methane is a blanket that's 86 times as thick as carbon, and nitrous oxide is 310 times as thick. So as we're facing this ticking clock of runaway climate change, we need to put the emphasis. We need to again focus on everything, but put a special emphasis on the things that matter most, and not at the exclusion of other things, but we need to pay special attention to it. And I think that our focus has been exclusively on fossil fuels, and it's good to have our focus on fossil fuels, but it's bad to have our focus exclusively on fossil fuels when animal agriculture is an equal culprit.
Well, there are animals and there are animals. So, of course, when people talk about livestock production or animal production, what comes to mind is the cow, because is the single most important animal in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But you know, a cow is different than a pig or chicken, and even pigs and chickens producing CAFOs are different in terms of greenhouse gas emissions than pigs and chickens produce sustainably or produce in, you know, agroecological way and all that. And as a matter of fact, animals have been an integral part of agriculture for most of our history in agriculture, no? It's just recently that we have disentangled the animals from the farms, because the farms have been, I mean, the animals have been integral for nutrient and for cycling of nutrient, etc. So I think that we should consider the production, the sustainable production of animals that have a smaller carbon footprint. Do you envision that in your perspective, no, and your proposal of what needs to be done? Do you envision that as also part of the solution? And I'm thinking about this because, as you mentioned in the book, you know, what we eat is so personal to us, and you have struggled yourself with that, and you have encountered also people that are very reluctant to give up their meat. So I would like you to comment a little bit on that.
So without a doubt, there's a hierarchy of the destructiveness of different animal species, and there's a page in the book where I actually just give the carbon footprint of different kinds of foods, not only different species of animals, but also cheese and eggs and vegetables. So eating a cow is an awful lot worse than eating a chicken, which is an awful lot worse than eating vegetables. To the point of factory farming and more traditional farming, there's enough free-range chicken meat produced in the country, in America right now, to feed the people of Staten Island. So the problem is that we have way too many people with way too strong an appetite for meat. The amount of meat and dairy that we consume right now is the equivalent of every person alive in the year 1700 eating 900 pounds of meat and drinking 1,200 gallons of milk every day. So a lot of that is due to an increased desire or ability to eat meat, and a lot of that is due to the population explosion. But it's our reality. There is no way that we can feed 7 going on 8 billion people the amount of meat, the amount of animal products that we are used to and presently desire without factory farms. I love the idea of transitioning away from factory farms to traditional farms. I visited a lot of farms like that when I wrote Eating Animals, and I met an awful lot of farmers. But it's a pipe dream until we really radically reduce the amount of these products that we consume. You know, I should say one surprising thing when I wrote Eating Animals was I expected that farmers would protest when I would do events, and that animal rights advocates would hold them back and defend me. And it was actually just the opposite. Farmers were the most consistent champions of that book, because farmers, the kinds of farmers that you're describing and that most of us imagine when we think about farming, despise factory farming. They despise industrialized agriculture. Democratic presidential hopefuls are in Iowa right now, and what presidential hopefuls do in Iowa and New Hampshire is pander, and they just say whatever people want to hear, and are effectively trying to buy votes that they might regret or have to somehow, with embarrassment, undo later. But the way that they are pandering to farmers in Iowa is with anti-factory farming legislation. It's really telling and really impressive.
Yeah.
So
that's encouraging.
Yeah. The bottom line is none of the things that we want to see happen, like the dismantling of the factory farm industry, can happen unless we make a move to eat very much less meat. In the most comprehensive analysis of the relationship between animal agriculture and global warming, which was published at the end of last year, the authors concluded that while people who live in undernourished areas in the world can afford to eat a little bit more meat and dairy. People who live in the United States and the United Kingdom have to reduce their meat consumption by 90% and their dairy consumption by 60% to avoid cataclysmic environmental results.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I was going to ask you about is that, well, basically, there are a significant number of people in the world that eat very little meat or no meat whatsoever. So it's just a smaller percentage of the population that has this enormous animal consumption. And so there is an inequality there, and you do talk about these inequalities in your book. I have a question also related to that, to eating that was submitted by a student. And I'm going to have to use my glasses here because it's a fine print. And it's related to this issue of inequality. But a little bit different than what we've been talking about. She say, it's one thing to eat less meat for climate change reasons, but how do you suggest one navigate your proposal for those who have inequitable food access, whether it be due to economic standing or access to the food?
Well, those are two very different issues. Economic standing is one thing, and not having access to foods is different.
Yeah.
So the economic argument is not true. The Harvard Medical School did a study of the economics of meat eating, also in 2018, and found that it's $750 a year cheaper to eat a vegetarian diet than a meat-based diet. 9% of Americans who make less than $30,000 a year describe themselves as vegetarian. 4% of Americans who make more than $75,000 a year describe themselves as vegetarian. And people of color are disproportionately vegetarian. People who don't have access to food, to fresh foods, is a completely different story, and that's a real problem. And that's a problem that we need to dig into and address, and certainly not expect the same changes of people who don't have access. That would be completely unfair. But we also shouldn't point to their existence as a reason for us who do have access to those foods not to change.
I agree. But so we have the issue of accessibility, the issue of, of economic accessibility, and you mentioned that it's cheaper to have a vegetarian diet. But what about people that eat in McDonald's or something like that? Obviously, I think that the problem then, when we look at that, is in the food system in general. It's more of a systemic problem of the food system that we have, especially in this country. It's not just that people are choosing to eat meat or not eat meat based on economics, but there are many forces that are pushing people in that direction because the system basically is pushing them in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the price of a McDonald's hamburger is not the price of a McDonald's hamburger.
Yeah.
All of the costs have been externalized through subsidies to the factory farm industry or a complete lack of environmental regulation. And if it were simply to cost what it costs, you would see people eating a lot less. Yeah. I don't know if it's a solution exactly, but it's a nice thing to see plant-based meats appearing now in fast food restaurants and in supermarkets. You can go to Burger King, any Burger King in the country now, and get an Impossible Burger. Are we going to be a great country if everybody's eating Impossible Burgers all the time instead of eating beef hamburgers all the time? No, it would be better if we were eating, real foods as often as possible. But that having been said, a Beyond Burger requires 99% less water than a beef hamburger, 93% less land, and produces 90% fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And it costs the same, despite the fact that there's not the same subsidy structure. So it's good. It's cool. I'm glad that it exists. And I'm very happy about the way that the fast food chains have brought it into existence. Kentucky Fried Chicken, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, has a plant-based chicken. Isn't it a very, very weird thing to say? A plant-based chicken. But then again, their chicken is very weird. If you give
Yes,
you know,
I agree.
like an animal that requires antibiotics to survive is weird. An animal whose body weight would crush its skeleton if it's allowed to exist out of its adolescence is weird. Yeah. All of the turkeys that are sold in America, are the product of artificial insemination because they've been bred to grow too big to have sex.
Yeah.
Is it right to say that that's real meat and that like a Beyond Burger isn't? There's a spectrum of realness and of naturalness, and we're not always paying attention to how unnatural the foods we think of as natural are. Definitely. But when KFC released this plant-based chicken, there were photographs in the New York Times of people lined up around the block to eat it. And I saw that, and I didn't think the future is now. I saw that and I thought, that's a lot of vegetarians who want to eat this food. But what did excite me were two things. One, KFC painted the restaurant green. And so they weren't just like providing a little substitute food for that, annoying contingent that is always, they were like really proudly announcing something. They wanted it to be on the front page of the New York Times, and they wanted to announce the connection to the environment. And in their statement, and this is the other thing, their public statement, KFC said, we don't really think of this as a food for vegetarians. We think of it as a food for meat eaters who want to eat less meat. Beyond Foods did a study of people who bought their products in a supermarket over, I don't know what it was, a month, a given period of time. And in that period of time, 90% of the people who bought Beyond Burgers also bought traditional meat, which is, I find that to be a really inspiring fact. We've historically, until very recently, maybe even until now, thought of this issue of reducing meat consumption as a binary, like you're a vegetarian or you're not. Those are just the options. And that's why you hear about people who were vegetarian until they went to this barbecue and ate chicken, and that was the end of their vegetarianism. Because there's no other option. You either are or you're not. Which is strange. We don't treat other sort of aspirations in that way. I try to be an honest person, but
You're not always.
I was at home for the weekend last weekend, and my mom came down the stairs. She's wearing a dress. She said, "Do you like this dress?" I said, "Yeah, I love that dress." And I didn't then just decide that I would take every future opportunity to lie. I did in that case. I'm making it sound worse than it was. It actually was a very nice dress. But
yeah, sure.
yeah, we need to move away from those identifiers that just measure people's distance from a kind of ethical perfection that no one's going to attain,
Yeah.
and is unnecessary, and instead measure the distance from doing nothing.
And I think you're very effective in the book talking about that and communicating that. And I really think that there are more and more people, at least in the United States, that are not vegetarian, don't consider themselves vegetarians, but that eat significantly less meat than they used to. And sometimes it's for health reasons, not necessarily for environmental reasons. But nevertheless, I think that it might not be as difficult to start cutting on the meat consumption as sometimes we think it will be. I think it is an attainable goal to have people eat less meat.
Yeah, I think that it's easy to overstate how difficult it will be, and it's easy to understate how difficult it will be. I've been a vegetarian since I was 9, but I've been a real on and off vegetarian, and a quite inconsistent vegetarian. And I'm not the kind of vegetarian who, despite my absolute intellectual conviction, I'm not the kind of vegetarian who finds meat disgusting or the phrase, meat is murder. I mean, I believe, look, meat is murder. There's no other There's no other way to accurately describe what meat is. Meat is murder. But that's not a phrase that comes to mind when I'm facing like a hamburger or a steak. Usually I think, wow, that smells really good, you know, and that looks pretty good. And that might even look better than the thing that's in front of me. And I would be happy enough to eat that. I'd be really happy to eat that. But I don't have to eat that. You know, if I were a lion, I would have no obligations beyond my craving. But I'm a human. I'm not a lion. And I have the ability to hold contradictory impulses in my mind and to weigh them and to say, I really want this, but I really want this other thing. It's hard to repress or negotiate with a craving, but it's not impossible. And there's another thing which we haven't talked about, which is sometimes saying no feels better than the thing that...
In retrospect, yeah.
Or even in the moment. You know, like the best steak you've ever had, right? The pleasure that it offered ends the second you swallow the last bite. Food does not continue to feel good after you have finished eating it. In fact, often it starts to feel bad after you finished eating it.
Depends on how much you eat.
Well, we tend to eat too much of the things that we like. So the feeling of being oneself, the feeling of acting on one's values and closing the distance between the person you imagine yourself to be or want to be and the person that you actually are, that provides a really good feeling. You know, everybody applauded in the introduction when we talked about the University of California system going carbon neutral. Why do people applaud? You know, because it's exciting to imagine, and it generates like a lot of positive emotions. If Michigan were to become the first carbon neutral campus in the country, it would require a lot of change, and some of the change would probably feel like sacrifice at the time, and some of the change would create frustrating inconveniences. Do you think Michigan would be like a happier campus at the end or a less happy campus?
Of course.
It'd be a happier campus.
Yes.
Your life would be better. Forget about the fact that you're doing the right thing. You'd be happier. And to read about yourselves in the newspaper and all the other campuses, you know, how envious the other campuses are around the country and how the other deans are calling your dean and saying, how did you do it? Let us learn lessons from you. I think it would feel amazing.
Yeah.
And it's something we don't talk about that often. We think about the efforts to save the planet as involving martyrdom, as opposed to maybe, you know, it will involve a mix of experiences and emotions, but it may be that the predominant experience is happiness.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Thank you. So, talking about human behavior, because your book has a big focus on human behavior. And I love the way that you have interwoven your own personal and family stories with historical events to basically make a point about the changes that are required, you know, to address climate change. So in your book, you focus a lot on the individual behavior. And you do talk about collective action. Like you give the example during World War II when everybody was turning off their lights and things like that. However, you don't talk that much about politics and the structural problems inherent in the capitalist system. And I am wondering if this is a tactical device, because you think that people will dismiss you if you start talking about, you know, these structural problems of the system, or if you truly believe that capitalism has nothing to do with climate change.
It's neither, actually. It's just the focus of the book is individual action, in the same way that I would acknowledge that the fossil fuel industry is a profound problem that we have no hope of, you know, even approaching a future if we don't get it under control. But I don't really write about it in the book because I feel like a lot of people are giving a lot of attention to it, and we have a high, at this point in time, a pretty solid informational foundation, a good, I don't think that the layperson is ignorant about the destructiveness of the fossil fuel industry, but I do think there's been some, we haven't paid enough attention to animal agriculture, and I wanted to take an opportunity to pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, we have no hope if we don't have systemic change, if we don't have legislated change. I am not the kind of person who would say individuals can do this alone at all. But we haven't paid a lot of attention to the real kinds of change that individuals can affect, or the interaction between individual change and systemic change. The ways that...
Yeah, that component I think is really important because they're definitely related, no? You have to have you have to have people being willing to go out in the streets to push for something, no? To push their governments to do something, or the president of their university to do something, no? So that is absolutely true.
It's how change always happens, that kind of virtuous cycle of the macro and micro influencing each other. We need the government to make it easier for us to make good decisions. Like we need for hamburgers to cost what hamburgers actually cost. And we can facilitate that change, that systemic change, by making changes in our own lives, by either demanding it, in marches and in writing, or I think more powerfully demanding it by changing our habits. The Amazonian deforestation is a acute example. We've all seen images of the Amazon on fire, and they're really alarming and extremely upsetting, except when you stop looking at them, at which point you forget about it, if you're like me and most people. But when you're looking at it, you're very upset. And that kind of negative emotion tends to direct itself at Bolsonaro, and maybe to some extent at Trump. But 91% of the Amazonian deforestation is for animal agriculture, either for creating land for livestock to graze or creating land to grow crops for the livestock to consume. There isn't going to be a global boycott of beef. But if there were a global boycott of beef, then we would preserve the Amazon. If we stopped eating beef, then we would at least reduce the deforestation to a completely manageable amount. But we need help to boycott beef.
But policies are, can either encourage people to eat more beef or disencourage them to eat more beef.
I completely agree. But who are the people who are going to make these policies that discourage us from eating beef? Elizabeth Warren, who is, I find to be an extremely impressive person and politician. Right, the other foot's about to drop, don't get too excited. Said in the recent CNN, in the climate debate, I'm not going to take away your hamburger. That's exactly what corporations want, is for the individual to feel all of the responsibility to buy a certain kind of light bulb. And I thought, God, she sounds like a Republican. Don't pry the gun from my cold, dead hands, and don't pry the hamburger from my cold, dead hands. The government needs our help, and we need the government's help.
So talking about the government, maybe just briefly, we can talk about the Green New Deal, or you can. I'm curious to know how you see that potentially as something that could move us in the right direction.
Well, it's extremely exciting. I mean, it's exciting that it's talked about, that there is, that it has a name, Like, one of the problems with the responses to climate change is the amorphousness of our responses. Just a little anecdote as a way to get back to the question. I did a reading recently, and afterwards there was a signing, and a young couple came up to me and pushed the book in front of me and opened it to the title page, which is normally empty, and it was filled with their handwriting. I said, oh, what's this? And they said, well, we're going to get married in a month, and we decided tonight that we really need to have a plan. Because if we don't have a plan for how we're going to live, then we'll probably just live as we've always lived, whatever our intentions are, whatever we say. And we wanted to codify it, to actually speak it aloud to each other and write it down. And their plan was to eat as vegetarians unless served meat at someone's house, to eat vegan 2 days a week, to have no more than 2 children, and to drive no more than 1,500 kilometers a year. You can agree with that, the details of that plan, you can disagree with that plan, but I don't think you should disagree unless you have a plan yourself. And at the bottom of the page, they'd drawn a line and it said witness under it.
And they want your
They wanted me to
signature.
sign it. And
That
I
was
found
clever.
that extremely moving
Yeah.
and upsetting because I realized I don't have a plan. It's not a joke. I mean, I wrote about a plan for eating, but that's only one portion of what one has to do. And not only do I not have a plan, which is particularly upsetting because of how much rhetoric I have and how many words I have. I know what to say, I know what sounds good. I know it sounds good to other people, and even worse, I know it sounds good to myself, you know? I know how to soothe myself. So much of the way we talk about climate change is self-soothing, even when people are apocalyptic. To say we're doomed is a kind of self-soothing because it excuses you from participation. It excuses you from the full range of emotions, which is not only gloom, but also anger, hope, depression, a feeling of motivation. But we need plans, we need to codify them, and we need witnesses. Like, we really need to share them with each other, share them with our friends, share them with our families. It would be great if they were just tacked to our refrigerators, you know? In this family, this is what we do. And the differences between our plans will be even more inspiring than the overlaps. You know, like acknowledgments of who we are, what our particular limits are. What I find it relatively easy to be a vegetarian. I find it rather difficult to control the amount of the number of flights that I take. Other people find it relatively easy to control the number of flights they take and very hard to eat differently. If somebody says to me, look, I've been thinking about this stuff and I've been honest with myself, I know what, I don't deny the science of, you know, the relationship between animal agriculture and climate change, but I have to be honest with you. The most I can imagine myself doing is like not eating meat on Mondays. I would say, if you're telling me that that's your limit, I respect you. Like, I believe you. I believe you. I can tell you that my limit is quite different, but then I bet you there are ways in which, you know, your limits in other areas are going to be far beyond mine. I think that we can respect each other's limits if we also agree to live by our limits. You know, it's one thing to say, I will not eat meat on Mondays. It's another thing to not eat meat on Mondays as a plan. So, you know, I think one of the challenges we're facing right now is how do we take this moment of raised concern and emotion and convert it into action, whether the action is individual action, like having a plan, or action to push the systems to change.
So that brings me to another big theme in your book, which is the difference between knowledge or knowing and believing, no? And in the book you start actually fairly early in the book with the story of Karski and in Second World War. Can you relate that story to the audience? Because I think not everybody knows about this. And then how you use that story to motivate that dilemma, no? of people knowing but not being persuaded enough to do something about climate change.
It's only like a page and a half, so it might be actually quickest if I just read it.
Yeah, sure.
Rather than doing my best to remember it verbatim, which I know is what I would do. Okay. In 1942, a 28-year-old Catholic in the Polish underground, Jan Karski, embarked on a mission to travel from Nazi-occupied Poland to London and ultimately America to inform world leaders of what the Germans were perpetrating. In anticipation of his journey, he met with several resistance groups, accumulating information and testimonies to bring to the West. After surviving as perilous a journey as could be imagined, Karski arrived in Washington, D.C. in June 1943. There he met with Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, one of the great legal minds in American history and himself a Jew. After hearing Karski's accounts of the clearing of the Warsaw Ghetto and of exterminations in the concentration camps, after asking him a series of increasingly specific questions, like, what's the height of the wall that separates the ghetto from the rest of the city? Frankfurter paced the room in silence, then took his seat and said, Mr. Karski, a man like me talking to a man like you must be totally frank. So I must say, I'm unable to believe what you told me. When Karski's colleague pleaded with Frankfurter to accept Karski's account, Frankfurter responded, I didn't say that this young man is lying. I said, I am unable to believe him. My mind, my heart, they're made in such a way that I cannot accept it. Frankfurter didn't question the truthfulness of Karski's story. He didn't dispute that the Germans were systematically murdering the Jews of Europe, his own relatives. And he didn't respond that while he was persuaded and horrified, there was nothing he could do. Rather, he admitted not only his inability to believe the truth, but his awareness of that inability. Our minds and hearts are well built to perform certain tasks and poorly designed for others. We're good at things like calculating the path of a hurricane, and bad at things like deciding to get out of its way. Because we evolved over hundreds of millions of years in settings that bear little resemblance to the modern world, we're often led to desires, fears, and indifferences that neither correspond nor respond to modern realities. We're disproportionately drawn to immediate and local needs. We crave fats and sugars, which are bad for people who live in a world of their ready availability. We hypervigilantly watch our children on jungle gyms, despite the many greater risks to their health that we ignore. Although many of climate change's accompanying calamities, extreme weather events, floods, and wildfires, displacement and resource scarcity chief among them, are vivid, personal, and suggestive of a worsening situation, they just don't feel that way in aggregate. They feel abstract, distant, and isolated, rather than like beams of an ever-strengthening narrative. As the journalist Oliver Buckerman put it in The Guardian, if a cabal of evil psychologists had gathered in a secret undersea base to concoct a crisis humanity would be hopelessly ill-equipped to address, they couldn't have done better than climate change. So-called climate change deniers reject the conclusion that 97% of climate scientists have reached. The planet is warming because of human activity. But what about those of us who say we accept the reality of human-caused climate change? We may not think that the scientists are lying, but are we capable of believing what they tell us? Such a belief would surely awaken us to the urgent ethical imperative attached to it, shake our collective conscience, and render us willing to make small sacrifices in the present to avoid cataclysmic ones in the future. Intellectually accepting the truth isn't virtuous in and of itself, and it won't save us. As a child, I was often told, "You know better," when I did something that I shouldn't have done. Knowing was the difference between a mistake and an offense. If we accept a factual reality, that we're destroying the planet, but are unable to believe it, we are no better than those who deny the existence of human-caused climate change, just as Felix Frankfurter was no better than those who denied the existence of the Holocaust. And when the future distinguishes between these two kinds of denial, which will appear to be a grave error and which an unforgivable crime?
Beautiful. So that's a really moving part of the book I found. And but I think basically the message here is that We need something that really touches our heart, that really moves us emotionally, to be able to do something. That we could know the reality of climate change, and we could know the science behind it, and we can accept that climate change is due to anthropogenic causes and all that. But because, like you argue in the book, in some parts, it's not such a clean story. It's not a story that tends to move us, no? It's messy, it's too technical at times. It can be boring even. People are not moved, even when they accept that climate change is occurring. They're not moved to do it. But I would say that perhaps the climate itself is very eloquent at telling the story of climate change, because so many people have been affected directly by climate change. And I'm telling you this coming from Puerto Rico, where a hurricane devastated the island. And people have been talking about climate change for many years. But after the hurricane, just 2 years after the hurricane, people were in the streets. Just last summer, about 1 million people were in the streets demanding the renunciation of the governor. And it was triggered in part by a chat that was revealed where the governor was making fun of the victims of the hurricane. So first of all, they leave the hurricane closely, they leave it there. They had suffered the consequences, and then there was this insult on top of it that moved people to do something about it. And I think that more and more, because of these climate catastrophes, the fires, the droughts, the hurricanes, etc., people that didn't know are knowing, but people that knew are more compelled to do something. Do you agree that that's the case, that things are changing and that there's perhaps we are about to do like a quantum leap change or shift in climate change to actually do something about it?
Well, I certainly hope you're right. And I do think that we're approaching a real quantum shift. So the bad news is there have been studies that have shown that communities that experience extreme weather events are less likely afterwards to attribute them to human-caused climate change, because there is this, particularly in America, this notion of like resilience. Like, what do Americans say when a community is destroyed by a hurricane or flood? What do they always say? We're going to rebuild right here, which is not an honest confrontation with the science. It's a denial of the science. It's a straight up denial of the science. Will weather events fully awaken us? If they haven't already, I was in Paris this summer for the record temperatures. People said, whoa, it's hot. And then they got on with their lives.
So what would it take then to move us?
So I think it's going to be a combination of things. One is we are going to find ways of telling the story that move us. Greta Thunberg is an incredibly effective narrator, and has been singularly effective at stirring people's emotions. Maybe we should also stop waiting to feel what's necessary and instead start doing what's right, even if it doesn't feel what's right, even if we don't have a well of feelings in that given moment, which comes back to this idea of having plans. A plan protects you from having to make the decision every time. One of the nice things about, despite what I was saying earlier about the potential problems with making diet an issue of identity, one of the nice things about being a vegetarian is it's just my plan for eating. And I don't have to wait for a well of emotion every time I look at a menu because I know what I'm not going to eat and I know what I'm going to eat. When I go to a store, and if there's something that I want, I don't wait for a well of emotion to tell me to pay for it rather than to shoplift. I do it, I pay for it because that's what I do, because that's what citizens do. And we need to have behavioral norms that are environmentally conscious, that don't require our feelings, but are just habitual. And by the way, a college campus is an amazing place for these kinds of changes to start to happen. If I were you, I would ask my dining services to invert like the expectations of a meal. Not to get rid of meat, not to make meat impossible for people who want it, but instead of there being, 6 things that you can eat and then the vegetarian option, there should be 6 things that you can eat and then the meat option. And people who want to eat it, great. They're not evil, they're not bad, we don't have to judge them. We should just make it easier on ourselves to have, to make good decisions. So I think there's a danger in overemphasizing feeling. And both because the feelings may not be there when we need them to be there, and because we may satisfy our feelings without actually doing anything, which is the danger of some of these activities like marches, which I hope everybody marches tomorrow. I hope it makes as much noise as it possibly can and it shakes the conscience of the government. We just have to make sure that on Saturday we don't say, I did my part on Friday.
Yeah, definitely.
Saturday has to be the beginning, not the after party. Saturday would be a great day to start to enact a plan that you've made for yourself.
Yeah, and it's good to remind everybody about the strike tomorrow. So I hope that all of you walk out of your jobs and your classes and join the strike, because it is an important thing to do. But like you say, don't stop there. That should be the beginning. Jonathan, I'm gonna finish by talking a little bit about the shift that I think we have to end on a positive note. And there was a poll, we were talking about this before, there was a poll recently that showed that in the United States, about 1/3 of the population now believe that climate change is human, is anthropogenic, and that it is a crisis and we need to do something about it right now. So that is a change from previous years. Things are shifting. There was a Nature Climate Change article that was published recently that showed that young people are having an influence on their parents, and especially young girls are having an influence on conservative fathers. And that brings me to Greta Thunberg that you mentioned before, this amazing young woman who received the prize, the Amnesty International Ambassador of Conscience Prize, just this week, I think it was. And in her acceptance speech, she talks about the debate, the shift that she is seeing, in the climate change debate, and inside the public, she attributed it to the young people, and as you know, the strike tomorrow is organized by young people, middle school kids and high school kids. And so you start your book basically directed at the general public, but you finish your book talking to your 2 sons. I don't know how old they are.
They're 13 and 10.
13 and 10. So you finish your book directing your final thoughts to your kids. Can you talk a little bit about what went through your mind when you were finishing the book and why you did that, and the role of young people in this movement?
I don't know that anything went through my mind. I think something went through my heart. It was not a deliberate choice. It was definitely not a literary choice. It was, this book, more than any book I've written, more than any of my novels, is really a record of my thought process.
It's very personal, yeah.
It's extremely personal. And I begin the book by talking about the oldest known suicide note
Yeah.
which was written in Egypt 4,000 years ago, which takes the form of a person debating his soul, asking his soul to consent to suicide. And one of the refrains in that note is, to whom do I speak today? It comes up again and again. To whom do I speak today? To whom do I speak today? And so I was thinking about that.
So you're reckoning to whom you're writing the book for.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think I started the book wanting to figure out something quite personal, because I found my own reaction to this crisis. It had become intolerable, really intolerable. I was just ashamed of myself, you know, to hear myself say over and over and over, somebody has to do something, somebody has to do something. And I went to marches, and I have the right T-shirts and bumper stickers and buttons, but I wasn't doing anything, and I knew it. And it created a kind of alienation inside of me, which I think an awful lot of people are experiencing right now. There's a Washington Post poll just a couple days ago that said that more than half of teenagers feel afraid and saddened by climate change. And I think it's not just teenagers. And we feel an alienation both from our fellow earthlings, you know, an awareness, particularly in America, of the fact that we are committing a kind of suicide, even though we won't be the first fatalities. We will be among the last fatalities. We probably won't even be among the fatalities in any large numbers. And a kind of looming, usually easy to repress awareness of an obligation to other people, paired with an alienation from ourselves. Like, we know what it feels like to not do what we ought to do. You know, it doesn't have to be at the forefront of your mind. It doesn't have to incite strong emotions for it to always be there, that knowledge. And it's revealed, I think, it's most powerfully revealed when we change. And we experience this profound relief. Like, now I'm doing the thing that I knew I should have been doing. So I felt a lot of that kind of disappointment and alienation. And so I started to investigate, what is it that I can do? And I mean that both in the sense of, what can I do that will have any kind of impact in the world, and also just what can I do? What are my limits? Because I might know that I should stop, that it would be best if I stopped flying, but I also know that I can't do that. That's on the other side of my limits. Maybe that makes me bad, maybe that makes me hypocritical, but it is my truth, so I might as well, you know, engage with it. And then at a certain point when I was writing the book, the to whom am I speaking broadened. And I realized there were both ideas, scientific truths and ideas, experiences that I wanted to share because I thought that they would resonate with other people. And I assumed, as I assume when I write anything, whether it's a novel or nonfiction, I assume that other people, that I have a lot in common with other people, you know, that we have a lot in common. And then as I reached the end, and I should say there's a kind of parallel narrative in this book of my grandmother's death. She died in the year that I wrote the book. As I approached the end, and as my grandmother approached her death and ultimately died, it became quite personal again. So it kind of closed up. But the you that I was addressing wasn't me, but my kids. And I returned to this idea of a suicide note and what a suicide note is, and how that first suicide note, which was titled Dispute with the Soul of a Man Who Was Tired of Life, we don't actually know if the author killed himself. You know, we have this artifact, but we don't know. And it's entirely possible that the note was an argument for survival, and that the end of the note was the beginning of a different kind of life. You know, we're so used to thinking of climate change as endings, the end of, you know, polar ice caps, the end of coastal cities, the end of you know, tolerable weather. And we never think about it as the opportunity for a beginning. Maybe that is the ultimate confrontation with climate change. It's not we're doomed, but we're going to begin. And so it's possible that the suicide note was like a life note, that the arguments for a confrontation with death can be a confrontation with life, and a reminder of why it matters and why we would fight at all. And so for me, it was very natural and unavoidable to think about my kids and to address them. And I was aware of the fact as I was writing this that I was also creating an artifact that they would read one day. Have you seen the monument for the Icelandic glacier that broke off?
No, I haven't seen it, but I read about it.
I literally can't even talk about it because I will start getting emotional, but you should Google it later. No need to make a scene right now. But it's one of the most effective responses to climate change I've ever seen. And it's 3 sentences, 4 sentences, and it perfectly articulates our moment and what we're facing, because it also captures like the what is unknowable, which is what we will choose.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this conversation. We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Start at Breakfast. I highly recommend it. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.